will now have a response, which Ian has very kindly agreed to improvise for us, because not much of what's been said today has been available to him. So this will be an impromptu response on some of a really wide range of very big questions. So good luck.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for being here this afternoon. And I had no idea today was the last day of your term. At Stanford, we would be more humane than to schedule something like this on the last day of term, knowing that nobody would show up on the last day of term. Certainly wouldn't still be sitting here at almost 5 o'clock, especially if I came down to the front of the room. So it's very nice to see so many people here and to be given the opportunity to respond to these 3 fascinating talks. I like doing responses, but I always find it sort of slightly weird. Always, what exactly are people expecting you to say here? I mean, are people expecting you to pick fights with all the people who've given papers? Professor Wang just pointed out people here do like to disagree with everything, so perhaps that should be my job to pick fights with everybody. But I wasn't actually planning on picking fights with everybody, unless you would like them.
Feel free.
Because I've found the talks today tremendously useful. Now, I don't remember now if I said anything about this yesterday or not, but the thing I'm supposed to be doing now, although I'm not actually doing it so far, is writing a book that's basically a history of the ancient world. And I sort of agreed that I was going to do this a few years ago, and then failed to produce anything, because there's all these books out there called Some Variation on a History of the Ancient World. I've used them doing undergraduate teaching and so on, but almost all of them are basically actually histories of Greece and Rome, with maybe a couple of other things thrown in, like Chester Starr's famous one. It's Greece and Rome with a little bit of Israel thrown in. And this is sort of the normal way these things get done. But I was thinking, well, it would be kind of fun to try to do a history of the ancient world that actually was a history of the ancient world, like a global level history of the ancient world. And obviously that's sort of kind of what I started talking about yesterday. And at the moment, I find when I start writing a new book, I always go through rather similar sort of mental process. And I start off usually with an envelope, and I write on the envelope what my book is going to be about. It's all tremendously clear, and it is just so brilliant. I'm astonished at myself. And then I start learning something about the subject, and I plunge into this chaotic phase where it's like, oh God, everything I thought is completely wrong. And I'm in the chaotic phase at the moment, as some of you might have noticed. So I found the talk today tremendously useful for thinking about a couple of the problems I feel I'm encountering in trying to write a book of this kind. And I thought for my response today, I would talk a bit about how the talks have helped me think about what I think are the 2 of the biggest problems I feel I've been encountering in trying to put together this project. And so one of them is what Eleanor Robson brought up a number of times in her talk about the depth of antiquity. And this, I think, is one of the big issues. If you're going to write this book about global history of the ancient world, the depth of antiquity is something you have to decide where you stand on this. And I agree with her very much on the need to confront the depth of antiquity. And she put it up on the sort of bullet point thing at the end, said that antiquity is, and I wrote it down so I get it right, antiquity is deeper, richer, and more various than any of us can encompass. And I guess what I was thinking looking at that is that antiquity is deep and rich and various, but I don't think it's deeper, richer, and more various than any of us can encompass. I think we are quite capable of encompassing all of these things if we make an effort, if we decide that's something we want to do. But if we stay in our bunkers, then I think this statement will remain true. We're not going to be able to encompass any of these things unless we make the effort, and the effort inevitably involves us being comparative. Otherwise, you just can't begin to attack any of these questions. And one of the things that strikes me about thinking about, well, what might we mean by a global antiquity, is that antiquity has different depths in different places. And this just seems to be completely obvious once you look around the world. And like I say, if you start with something like another of Eleanor's points about how state formation is something that goes back a very long way in the Middle East. And you need to go back, say, 3,500, 3,000 BC for Uruk in Egypt, for the first organizations that archaeologists would normally call states. But say if you you are instead hovering around the Indus Valley. Well, you need to go back probably beyond 2500 BC there, but not as far as you need to go in Mesopotamia and Iraq. If you're hanging out in China, you need to go back to, say, often people say now 1900 BC at Air Lido, you start to see something you could meaningfully call a state with a proper government and so on. If you go to the Americas, it seems to be a bit more disputed there, but I think the majority opinion, so far as I can make out, is there you'd have to be hanging around till about the year sort of 1 BC or AD, somewhere around there, the Moche in the Andes, Teotihuacan in Mexico. Here you're dealing with the rise of genuine states. As those of you who were there yesterday will have noticed, there is a certain amount of disagreement over Africa, and some of this, I think, is just definitional issues. But I mean, certainly by somewhere around the year AD 1000 in southern and eastern sub-Saharan, southern and western sub-Saharan Africa, you're starting to see organizations I think just about any anthropologist would call a state. So we're going to get a very, very long, 4.5 millennia range of dates, the beginning of state formation in different parts of the world. If, again, you want to talk about global antiquity, I think you've got to ask the question, why? And I would say the answer here seems to me to be that this sort of range we see in the beginning of state formation in different parts of the world is simply one part of a much bigger ancients differences in depth problem that, again, I think is just fundamental to thinking about there being a global of antiquity. And I would say you can't understand the ancient world without getting to the bottom of this problem. And I agree completely with Eleanor Robson on this. And I would say to get to the bottom of the problem, you've got to go back to the end of the Ice Age. And at the end of the Ice Age, obviously, the world warms up. Otherwise, it would not be the end of the Ice Age. The world warms up, and agriculture begins to become possible in those parts of the world where there are plants and animals that can be domesticated, which is by no means the whole world, nowhere near the whole world, very selected number of places in the old world. And what, and again, you'll remember Kevin and I had a little disagreement on what has been decisively proven to be true and what has not. But it seems to me it's been pretty much decisively proven to be true, that there's an almost one-to-one correlation between the density of potentially domesticable plants and animals in a region and the date at which domestication happens. And I think this is exactly what we should expect, because I think geneticists have proved another fact, that people are basically all the same everywhere you find them in the world. And if that's true, then we should expect that in those places where it's relatively easy to become farmers, that's where it'll happen first. And in those places where it's really, really difficult, like Siberia, where you can't become a farmer, that's where it's going to happen last. And this is exactly what we do find. Starting around, say, 9,500 BC in Southwest Asia, you begin to get the first signs of domestication of plants and animals. A couple of thousand years later, where the density of resources is slightly less great in South and East Asia, you begin to see the first signs there around 7,500 BC. Over the next 5,000 years, you see similar things underway independently in the Andes, in Mexico, in West Africa, South Africa, North America. And in every case, the density of locally available domesticable plants and animals maps on very, very closely to the point in time at which the process of domestication begins. Now, the reason I'm going off on this rant about domestication is it seems to me if you want to understand global antiquity, you can't do it without a time frame that takes you back to the end of the Ice Age. Otherwise, you're never going to get it. And I think this is why we've done such a bad job at it so far. Basically, as I understand it, if you go to each of these regions I was just talking about, where we see your indigenous heartlands of domestication beginning over the 5,000 years or so after the end of the Ice Age, in each case, about 2,000 years after we see the first signs of the domestication of plants and animals, farming beginning, about 2,000 years later, we've got a pretty full-blown package of agricultural village life going in all of these places. Another 4,000 years after that, usually, you get the first signs of local states and cities emerging. Usually some kind of writing system comes along with them. If you wait another 2,500 to 3,000 years, in each region where time has allowed this, you see states starting to turn into what some comparatists would call real empires, political organizations, 1 million, 2 million plus square kilometers. in one part of the world, another 2,000 to 2,500 years after the beginning of proper empires, you get an industrial revolution happening. Now, each of these paths, each of these regions, whether you're talking about Mexico or the Mediterranean or wherever you might be, the path seems to me to be rather similar in each place. I mean, the chronology is rather similar in each place, the length of time it takes you to move between these stages, and the broad outlines of what people are doing. And again, this seems to me to be what we should expect. If we believe that all people are basically the same animals, we all share common ancestors back in Africa, this is what we should expect. There are differences, obviously, between the different places. And one of the things I've become really obsessed with at the moment is comparisons between the New World and the Old World, where we've got genuine natural experiments. You have two parts of the world that are almost entirely separate from each other for a very long period. And if you really work at it, I've found you can convince yourself that the New World and the Old World follow basically the same developmental path. But, I mean, I want to believe this, but it is actually quite difficult to talk yourself into believing it. The differences are really fascinating. So we're planning to hold a conference soon at Stanford where all the problems will be solved, and the New World, Old World differences will all be laid to rest. So this, I think, is one of the big things. And I think Eleanor was quite right to insist on the need to go deep, to understand what you're thinking about with antiquity. You've got to go deep. And one of the big things we see is these very, very long-term paths that start up once societies begin this journey that's powered initially by agriculture and the population growth that this fuels. But I think my sense of it is that there's also a second dimension to the story that gets going. And basically, the further a society, a region, goes down this path that starts with the beginning of farming, the more the social development increases in the region, the bigger the units become, but demographically and geographically, spatially. They spread out and they start banging up against each other. And you start getting what in many ways had previously been almost sort of separate planets, like, say, sort of the western end of Eurasia, the eastern end of Eurasia, for a very long time, have very little contact. But by the time of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, they are increasingly coming into contact with each other and influencing each other. And it seems to me that the second dimension of the big ancient story is that as you get these bigger, more complex societies having more to do with each other, the parts of the world that got a head start in this process, which is basically the western end of Eurasia, is one that got a 2,000-year head start on the rest of the world because it happened to have the densest concentrations of domesticable plants and animals. When these regions that got the early start bumping up against regions that didn't get such an early start, the regions with the early start tend to stomp all over the regions that didn't get an early start. And you see the expansion of these core regions, usually through a combination of demographically driven conquest and migration combined with emulation and resistance along the borderlands where, say, early on where you're getting farming societies expanding into hunter-gatherer societies, later when you're getting formal political empires expanding and taking over their neighbours, all of these processes going on together. But one of the things we see over and over again is the places that get the early start down this path of generating more and more complex societies tend to cut off the local developmental sequence of the people they're running up into. And so, I mean, the most famous example, of course, is the conquistadors. Go to the New World around 500 years ago and encounter what are basically Stone Age societies still. Although they're sort of somewhat slightly literate Stone Age societies, quite urbanized Stone Age societies, but they are still Stone Age societies. And the Europeans show up there and basically annihilate these societies. And that's the extreme case, but it's a story that had already been going on for many, many thousands of years before that. And for me, this has been just a really interesting thing to think about, because it seems to me, I started life as an ancient Greek specialist, you can't make any sense out of ancient Greece unless you see it as a periphery to a Near Eastern core. Archaic and classical and Hellenistic Greek history, that's what it is. It's the story of core-periphery relations, with the Greeks emerging from being a periphery to being a sort of semi-periphery, as Wallerstein liked to call it, to becoming a core in their own right, and they conquer the old Near Eastern core. And very similar thing then happens with the Romans being a periphery to a Greek core. And I think this just without that, you can't understand the ancient Mediterranean story. But the larger global story, I think, is this one of like two cross-cutting stories. The local story that unfolds on the kind of continental, subcontinental level of following down this developmental path, combined with the globalizing story of different regions banging up against each other and sometimes traumatically devastating each other. And I would say that, like, if you lived in the ancient world, the most important fact for you was the point at which your region in the ancient world had started down this path. So, like, if it's 2000 BC and you drop down in Mesopotamia, you're in the Ur has just been destroyed, just near the end of the third dynasty of Ur. You've got a tremendously complex urbanized society. If you had dropped down in China, you would be sort of at the threshold of state formation because the whole process started so much later there. If you had dropped down in Scandinavia, you'd be down very much within tribal society, still relying very heavily on swidden cultivation and so on. And your life experience would be determined very, very heavily by the date at which your part of the world started down the road from cultivation to domestication. And so if you want to write a global history of the ancient world, you can't possibly do this unless your definition of ancient goes back to the end of the Ice Age. Otherwise, you are missing out all the most important stuff that starts in the story. You cannot talk about the Roman Empire without first talking about the Ice Age. This is what I have learned. My Roman historian colleagues remain remarkably skeptical about this, I've got to say, but I'm going to win them over. So, okay, what else? Oh, yeah. So this thing is one of the big things, and the talks today were tremendously helpful for me for sort of thinking about this and jotting notes down as people were talking. The other big question, though, I've got with writing this book, the other big problem, how do I end this book? How do I get out of this book, having started in it? Where do I stop? And this, of course, is where David Dovray's paper was tremendously helpful, because I guess there have been two ideas that I've been wrestling with, and I'm starting to think after today that I actually don't have a choice. In fact, it is pretty obvious what I've got to do. I mean, you came up with this wonderful line, you're ancient till you're modern. And I think, yeah, actually that's true. Yeah, that's the answer. You're ancient till you're modern, and that's... The way I have to end my book is by recognizing what I guess I already knew but have been trying to ignore. I mean, I just got this new book that's out any day now, Foragers, Farmers and Fossil Fuels. That appears to be telling me that you're prehistoric, then you're ancient, then you're modern. And that's it. And so, yes, I think you're right. I think you've answered my problem for me. The two things I was wrestling with was that one obvious way to end a book about a global antiquity would be with the Industrial Revolution, with the transformation of the world from a farming world to a fossil fuel world. But that poses a number of problems for me, like not knowing anything about what we normally call the Middle Ages. This is a big problem for me in writing this book, so that would have to be addressed. But like I say, I feel like I'm being forced towards somehow making that the ending point. A couple of years ago, I was invited to do this really interesting thing, to be a consultant for the History Channel, this big new world history series they're making called Mankind. I don't know if any of you saw it. Huge, big budget thing. It's an appalling experience being an advisor to these shows, because you talk to all these different people who totally ignore everything you say. And they keep insisting that you talk to them more, so they can ignore you more aggressively in the later discussions. It's a completely humiliating experience. But one of the things that I found most entertaining about it was, I think it's 12 parts in this series they had. And each episode would be broken into 4 or 5 separate, very visual stories about stuff that's going on. And then almost every story, it's all narrated by this guy with this incredible, deep, gravelly voice. At the end of almost every story, he would say, "The world would never be the same again." And then this got me thinking, because it seems to me there's only 3 times in human history that you can actually say that. And once is the evolution of modern humans, and yet the world has never been the same since then. Once was the origins of agriculture, and once is the fossil fuel industrial revolution. Those 3 things, yet the world was never the same again. All the rest, it's all noise, it's all details. And so having spent so much time in my last few books saying this, I now realise, well, yes, I can't just pretend I didn't say that. I have to take that seriously at the end point. The alternative I'd been thinking about, which I'm now, again, after what you were saying, beginning to think this is just completely incoherent, I don't know what I was thinking, was to say, well, maybe I should think about the story as being the ancient is this period of rising social development you get after the invention of agriculture, and we can think of the story ancient being the times while development keeps increasing up to the limits of what is possible for an agrarian society, which I would say, and again, not everybody agrees on this, of course, but I would say we see that with the Roman Empire about 2,000 years ago. They have pretty much gone as far as you can go, I would say, in a purely agricultural economy. And then they kind of get stuck there and it all falls to bits. Song Dynasty China, I would say similar kind of thing about 1,000 years ago. Go about as far as you can go in the agrarian society. My sense of it is, although it's a bit sketchy at this point, is that by the 17th and 18th centuries, in Qing Dynasty China, and Mughal India, and Ottoman Empire, and Western Europe and its overseas colonies, again, these are all going about as far as you can possibly go in the 18th century, the purely agrarian economic base. But I was thinking, well, perhaps the way to tell this story would be to tell it in different parts of the world up to the point at which you get societies developing to a score on my social development index in the low 40s, which I think is about as far as you can go with an agrarian civilization. And then after you've hit that level, then your local medieval is what you get kind of between the first time you reach the peak of agrarian societies and then having an industrial revolution, which I think is an impressively incoherent concept. But it seemed very clever when I thought of it. So it'd be like the 1st century AD, perhaps in the Mediterranean, 11th, 12th century in China, 18th century across the complex societies in the old world. Now, I'm now thinking I've just got to abandon that because it's ridiculous. And it seems to me medieval, I mean, I would agree with you completely. Medieval seems to me an extremely useful concept if you're doing European history, if you're doing Mediterranean-based history, extremely useful concept within the western end of Eurasia. I think it gets to be a much less useful concept as you go more, try to take it more globally, which and the implication, I think, of the way I had been thinking about ending my story was that you do have to have something of a global Middle Ages as well, except I now realise it just didn't make any sense. And Professor Wang's paper, I thought, was also very helpful for me in just thinking about how little sense that idea was making. And I really enjoyed reading your paper. I mean, I just, where'd you go? You've disappeared. Over there. I really, really enjoyed reading your paper because I read a little bit about some of these things about how people in East Asia were thinking about periodization and the ancient world, but I still know almost nothing about it. And so while I'd heard of Liang Qichao, I'd never actually read any of what Liang Qichao has said. And this thing, an ancient period from the Yellow Emperor to the First Emperor, and then a medieval period from the Qin dynasty to the death of the Qianlong Emperor. I've not read any of his work, so I don't know anything about it, but that just sounds really weird. My impression is, well, is this just a reaction to what the Western scholars are doing and a feeling, well, we have to do the same thing? Or, I don't know, I'd be interested to read this and find out, does he have real reasons for saying this? And another thing I've just found really fascinating in your paper was what you're talking about with the debates over the idea of antiquity in China, which got me thinking that this is something I should probably say more about than I was planning to do in my own book on global antiquity, about the kinds of debates you get in different places about what the ancient world is and particularly what it means. I mean, this thing you're suggesting that you get sort of high ancient and then lower ancient, then modern, and there's a sort of moral quality to this, which of course I guess there is, of course, for the Europeans as well when they're talking about classical antiquity. And I'd never heard of Gu Zhou, who you mentioned, who wrote the book about the Greek polis and sort of democratization of China during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, that's just I'd never heard of it. Is this available in English? Do you know? Oh, that's bad news. Oh well. That's just fascinating stuff. But so yeah. my sense of it is, definitely talking about a medieval period in Chinese history. It's just very difficult to do if by medieval you mean the same thing that you mean by medieval when you're talking about Europe. And I know some people will suggest that you can perhaps talk about sort of medieval and then Renaissance in China if you think about, say, something like the rejection of Buddhism in Tang Dynasty times, and the some of the Northern Song scholars who are very self-consciously jumping back over the sort of the Buddhist era and going back to ancient times, and a bit like Europeans. Some of these are saying, well, we are renewing Song Dynasty China by reaching back to the wisdom of the ancients, and I am picking up on what the ancients did, and they're trying to be Renaissance men in the same sense as you get in Renaissance Italy. People trying to be and succeeding in being masters of many, many, many different fields. But still, it's a very different sort of concept, I think, from talking about European medievalism. So yeah, I'm feeling now that perhaps what I need to do is to steal your phrase from you about people being ancient until they're modern. And that will probably become the main idea I use throughout my whole book. So I've had a very good day. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
So I think actually this, how good a day it's been. I think we can work out by comparing what happens in this book, so Ian's latest, which begins with an exposition of his approach. It has 4 responses to that, and then Ian's response to it, which is entitled "My Correct Views About Everything." So to have sown a doubt about an aspect here is quite an achievement. Thank you very much, Ian. That was brilliant. We now have lots of time for discussion, and not just with Ian, but with the other speakers as well. Before we do that, I wanted to actually do what we normally do right at the end, which is to thank the thankings in case people have to leave early, and also make an admin announcement, which is the reception, which is after this, is not in the location indicated on the posters that you and the invitations that you may have seen. It's been moved to Gordon House, 29 Gordon Square. That is correct on the paper program that I have copies of here. So if you've got that, look at that. There will be people heading in that direction, of course. But I want to make sure that everyone has a chance, at least, of getting to the drinks and doesn't end up across the road finding nothing to drink whatsoever. But the thankings go first of all. So that we can continue discussing until the last minute without having to interrupt proceedings. The thankings clearly go to Credoc and Maria Wyke and Mike Rowlands, in particular as the directors, for encouraging this and indeed funding the event. The various helpers there and there, and also David Alabaster in the Department of Greek and Latin, who's been extremely helpful in getting all this organised. And of course to the speakers in the audience, but that I will save to the end. Okay, so let's move on to the general phase of discussion. Just to recap, because there have been so many issues that have come across our desks today. Part of it was the emic ethic distinction that David introduced, but that really was already evident in Eleanor's paper and in Professor Wang's paper as well. The idea that there is an indigenous, if you like, concept of the antique, which we need to consider, and I would stress, it's perhaps an obvious point, but that's not the same as simply talking about history a long time ago. I imagine lots of civilizations and cultures and societies have an idea of that there is a past, and that some of the past is really quite a long time ago. That's perhaps not in itself enough to accredit them with the notion of antiquity, which seems something a bit more bounded, something, as David was saying, perhaps separated from the modern world by some other period. Certainly not the same as saying something like classical antiquity, the label that we've been stuck with for a while, which but we do find in China as well, clearly, the idea of a part of the past that's kind of a model to learn from, classic in that sense. So those distinctions between that emic notion of antiquity and the ethic notion, which is we are looking at it from the outside. If we look at the ethic notion, how useful or what does antiquity mean and how useful is it to us as a sort of analytical tool, I guess we've looked at periodization in some detail in all the papers. David Davray in particular was arguing for a longue durée view, which I'm sure Ian very much agree with. I think, though, the emphasis, David's emphasis very much on continuity, some of a quite long range of time. Ian's, in a way, recurring patterns, I suppose, but in that respect also more on change. The periodization, the question of periodization, and very glad to hear Ian come out and saying, well, I really am distinguishing only between antiquity and modern, because that seemed to be where it was going, and if that's where it was going, we should pursue that interesting conclusion. David's suggesting that periodization is nevertheless useful, but only as a crutch, to use that word again. For practical reasons, it can be useful to make distinctions within this enormous span of time, even if perhaps in analytical terms it doesn't always work. But since you didn't want to pick a fight, but I will try to start one. Saying possibly. As an example of where it might make a difference, whether or not, what periodization you take and how global you take them. I think David's example was, as a crutch, it's not the longue durée continuities override this, but for example, if you wanted to draw a line, the collapse of Roman imperial structures would be an obvious line to draw. And clearly, if you're looking at Western Europe, that's got to be true. I would say, I'm trying to fill your shoes for 5 seconds, you would probably say, yes, but if you take the global perspective, then you will see that actually all of the most advanced developments are not happening in Western Europe, but they're happening further east. They're happening in, you've still got the Byzantine Empire carrying on cheerfully. You've got a massive, highly developed Islamic culture in those regions. So from that point of view, if you take the global view, that marginal event, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, is not really a line worth drawing. So I perhaps state your argument more strongly than you would like. But I think that might be an example of where the approaches really diverge, and where we really might have to come to blows if we wanted to argue about the end or the beginning of antiquity and what impact a global perspective might have that isn't necessarily obvious if you stick to the more traditional periodizations and the narrower geographical span. And finally, we haven't said much about this, but I mentioned it at the start, and given the brief that Credoc has to study the dynamics of civilization, said at the start, Ian's got very clear models as to what type of dynamics we might find. But I guess one fairly fundamental question is whether what we are trying to see develop is itself adequate. If that's enough as an interpretation of history. Clearly, you said yourself in yesterday's lecture, it's part of what historians do. There are other things that historians can do. It's not the whole story. But in a way, I guess your narrative presupposes that this index of social development, the measure of civilization, as you could call it, that is amongst the most important things that we should look at. And given the title of your first book on this subject, Why the West Rules, one could perhaps argue that these are indices of what put the West where it is today, or just about still is today. Is that, in fact, perhaps a very modernizing and Eurocentric approach to history, to focus primarily on those things that answer that question, which is really not the only question that historians could address. So that's my attempt to sum up some of the issues that were addressed today, and I invite comments and questions. David.
I can see that you haven't forgotten your early training in the rhetoric of the ancient world, because, of course, your formula, your ancient until your modern, was my quoting you back at yourself rather than anything that I had come up with or proposed to you. I think I have nailed your problem.
Excellent. It would be a very good day.
Thanks to my quick preview of your book, which I stole for a few minutes before your response. And in that, you say that you think it's a truth self-evident that there is a small subset, that there's a small set of values that all humans share, And then you give a list of values which are very much the ones you would find in Stanford or Cambridge or such like places. And I think it's because of your assumption that values are more or less common to all human societies that you are so flattening differences between different regions and different periods and grouping them under the very broad rubric of being agrarian societies or highly developed states or empires, leaving out a lot of the most interesting action, which are things like the differences between Judaism and Buddhism and indeed secular liberalism. And I think that it's the tuning out of values that is flattening your story so that you're grouping too much together. And I, just as a way of a counterexample, remember the one that Mary Midgley quoted, that Japanese has a word for to try out your new sword on a casual passerby. And I think that is symptomatic of the very great differences in values that you can find between societies, and I think it's our job as historians to trace those differences.
Well, where's my new sword? Yeah, flattening out differences. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm hardly the first person to notice that there are lumpers and splitters in the world, and I fall very firmly on one end of the spectrum. It seems to me that almost all of my colleagues in the humanities fall at the other end of the spectrum, which makes the job interesting. Yeah, no, you've given me an opportunity to do a short sales pitch for my new book. Excellent thing. But yeah, this book, it's called Foragers, Farmers and Fossil Fuels, How Human Values Evolve. And I wrote it because I was invited to Princeton University a couple of years ago to give the Tanner Lectures in Human Values, which was great. I mean, it's a very big honour. It's a really nice thing. You can't say no to doing this. But I was a little bit anxious because it's held in the Princeton Center for Human Values, which is like the ultimate core of analytic moral philosophy in the world. And I have never studied moral philosophy. I don't believe I've ever read a book by a major moral philosopher. I've not given a great deal of thought to moral philosophy at any point. And so I think, well, this could potentially be a little awkward, going into the absolute core, the lion's den here. And then I realised, well, no, the reason they've asked me, they're probably aware that I'm not a moral philosopher. They've asked me to come along and be light relief. After several seasons of the greatest philosophers in the world coming, they think it's time for something else. And they do this in the Princeton Tanner series. They regularly bring in someone who's not a philosopher, but has something to say the philosophers will find either outrageous or amusing or just absurd. And that was my job. So why was I telling you all that? I have no idea now. But I mean, yeah, that's the reason I got started writing this book was I thought, well, I should take a look at the recent volumes that have been published in this series of books from the Tanner Lectures at Princeton. And I was very struck that there were these sort of two strands going on. There were, as most of the books were sort of fairly conventional moral philosophy stuff by the top people in the field that would sometimes talk about the tremendous diversity of values you find around the world and the challenges of trying to figure out what is the one-size-fits-all best system of moral philosophy. And then you've got a really small number of books, either by or influenced by evolutionists, saying, all humans have moral values of some kind. All humans everywhere in the world tend to have a sense of, say, fairness is one of the big things. We all believe in some sort of idea of fairness. And there are things that Hans might do to me that I would consider to be unfair. And like if he would say to me, you can't have any wine at the reception, I would think that was unfair. And I would be very angry about this, about being treated by him in a way that was unfair, because it would mean he was kind of negating who I was as a person. And all over the world, you do find values about fairness and are very, very important. And what the evolutionists point out is that you get similar kinds of things among the other apes, among chimpanzees, among gorillas. You also get them, to some extent, capuchin monkeys. It's been claimed you can identify a sense of fairness among dolphins. And the suggestion the evolutionists make is that values are an evolved adaptation, that animals that evolve toward the sort of equilibrium point for their species in terms of the way they value things in the world are more likely to pass their genes on to the next generation than animals that don't come so close to the equilibrium point. Values are evolved adaptations, which is why all humans have them. But if that's true, then why do they vary so much around the world? Because obviously they do vary wildly. Many cultures do not have a word for casually trying out your new sword on the passerby. They vary enormously. So this is what I was trying to tackle in this book. And I felt that when you sort of put them all in the pot together and took a look at it, you can actually see three broad systems of values around the world. And what I felt we could learn from that is while values may be an evolved adaptation among humans, there's something like a sense of fairness. It's not too difficult to see how that could be an evolved adaptation. What people interpret fairness to mean, that's what varies. We have this level of interpretation on the biologically evolved values because we're more complex animals than the other animals. And on the whole, in foraging societies, people tend to think fairness means treating everybody more or less the same, that all people are basically the same. There are gender distinctions, but they're not that huge. Some people are good hunters and some are not, but it's not that big of a deal. You should treat everybody pretty much the same. In farming societies, peasant societies, on the whole, people tend to say different people are different, and it's unfair to treat people who are different the same as each other. Kings are different from people like Hans. Hans is not a king, so I should treat the king differently from Hans. Men are different from women, and I should treat them differently. And women are, the difference is one of superiority and inferiority. And it would be unfair to treat a woman the same as a man. I would be going against the requirements of morality. But then since the Industrial Revolution, we've increasingly come back into a world where it's the sameness is what strikes us. And we tend to think it's unfair to treat people in a different way. We've launched this assault on political and economic to some extent, but particularly on gender hierarchy. The world has never seen anything like what happened in the last 200 years. So that's what I try to explain in my book. And astonishingly, I come to the conclusion it's all driven by very materialist factors. And in fact, it's the way we capture energy from the world around us, whether you're doing it from wild plants and animals as a forager, or domesticated plants and animals as a farmer, or fossil fuels as a fossil fuel person. This is what actually drives this story. So thank you for the opportunity to do my little sales pitch. But yes, you're right. I mean, I flatten out a lot of differences. I think the differences you pay attention to should be driven by the questions you choose to ask. If you want to ask a question saying, why do we get this great variety in values, even though values are an evolved adaptation, you have to flatten out a lot of difference. You've got to look at the whole planet across 20,000 years in 2 50-minute lectures as they did originally, and that means that much flattening. If you're looking at a much smaller question, then you flatten out a lot fewer differences. So it's a bit of a cop-out, but I'm tempted to say that the flattening thing is really it's just about what kind of questions you want to answer. Long response, I won't do that again.
But would it be the case that when you look at the smaller area or the smaller period, the smaller topic, that you can still apply the same explanatory categories? Use your fundamental ideas for explaining more specific ideas in specific places, or does it only work globally and flattening out?
I mean, I think it tends to be a more powerful method at the higher levels of abstraction. But of course, if it breaks down altogether as you get down into detail, then clearly there's something very, very seriously wrong with this. And so, yeah, I think I talk about this quite a bit in the book. I think when you start trying to answer very large-scale questions, one of the big problems that always comes up is what constitutes falsification of your theory? How do you know when you're wrong? If you've got this theory that you can sum up in one paragraph that claims to explain everything about the history of 20,000 years of human values, there are obviously going to be a number of exceptions to the claims made in the book. How do you know when there are so many exceptions that you're just being stupid now? And actually, the first time I ever gave that serious thought was at another set of Tanner lectures, and Colin Renfrew was invited out to Stanford, and he talked about his language dispersal stuff. I'm not quite sure why that was human values, but it was. And he's talking about his language dispersal stuff and the origins of Indo-European language and their spread. And all the archaeologists in the room kept coming up with exceptions to what he was saying. And Colin, I mean, I'm sure many of you know Colin, in his inimitable way, poo-pooed all the exceptions, and nothing that you're saying matters in the least little bit. And then Alison Wiley, the philosopher, was one of the respondents, and she raised this question: how do you know when there are so many exceptions that you're wrong? And that, I think, to me, I would say that's the biggest challenge for the global level stuff. You know you're wrong. The question is not, am I wrong about something? Of course I'm wrong. I'm always wrong. You can't not be wrong when you do this. How wrong am I? Am I so wrong that the whole thing becomes stupid, or am I just wrong enough?
Well, may I come back, because you're talking about the same, about these agrarian societies. Now, if you take something like the Islamic world and the Buddhist world, I think the differences are so great that, yeah, you are too wrong. The whole thing falls down. I mean, the whole, and this isn't because I'm a splitter rather than a lumper. I'm a hardline Weberian. And I think his two-way process of the material and the ideas and the open-mindedness about which way the direction goes, that's the right kind of lumping to do. If you've got a system that flattens Islam and Buddhism, that argument is broken down.
Yeah, I guess again it's a bit of a cop-out, but I can't help but feel that the precise question you're asking is always decisive here. I'm sure there are many, probably nearly all questions that a historian might choose to ask on which what you're saying is absolutely right. And that if you can't tell the difference between a Buddhist society and a Muslim society, something is going seriously wrong here. I felt with this particular question about the evolution of human values, obviously there are differences between Buddhist and Muslim societies, and Buddhist and Muslim and Christians and all kinds of other groups of people. But some of the biggest issues about the interpretation of something like fairness, which was the major thing I focused on in this book, the differences don't seem to me to be that great. I mean, I think in the Buddhist and the Muslim societies and the Christian ones, and as far as I know, pretty much every farming peasant-type society, there's general agreement, yeah, that gender hierarchy is correct and proper, and women are subordinated to men, and that's as it should be. That wealth inequalities, yes, of course there are wealth inequalities, and it's right that some people are richer than others, and I might be angry about my personal place in the hierarchy, might want to change that. But challenges to the idea of hierarchy, saying hierarchy, political hierarchy, saying that's wrong, that's much less common. And I mean, I was very struck by this thing you see again and again in peasant societies. There's this Russian saying, the boyars are bad, but the Tsar is good. The idea of hierarchy and having a great ruler over you and people telling each other what to do, that's all fine. It's just the particular people who happen to be above you, they're all wicked and they are letting down the system. And by rising up violently and beheading and castrating the local boyars, you're actually doing the Tsar a favour here, because he would want to know that these people are bad, and he would be glad to know that you just castrated the local lord, because in practice it rarely turned out that the Tsar was pleased about this news. But I mean, this is something I think we see over and over again in agricultural societies, sort of basic acceptance of the principles of hierarchy in a way you don't see in the foraging world, and I would say only seem in a smaller and very different way in the fossil fuel worlds. But again, you immediately run into the falsification problems. I think the big one with that particular argument is that so much of the historical literature is dominated by the people at the top of the hierarchy who, amazingly think hierarchy is a really good thing. And it's only when you get into the 20th century and you've got the work of social scientists going out to agricultural societies to look at, do you begin to hear the voices of people lower down the hierarchy. But I think one of the things they often do find is, to the anthropologists, often surprising amount of acceptance of the principle of hierarchy. But yeah, we could argue all day about these things, but I do think a lot of it comes down to the questions we ask.
There is a question from Greg out there.
Uh-oh. Greg always asks really difficult questions, so it's not my fault that I can't answer it.
I'm not sure it's a question, it's a comment, I think.
It's worse.
How we constitute the object of study of antiquity. I think I'm putting out something Hannah said already, which is there have been two different approaches taken this afternoon. The one is where antiquity is regarded as unproblematically out there, something that you can measure without too much difficulty. And the other is maybe more what David was saying, that any given antiquity is the production of a particular modernity. I think that's what you're saying. And that different modernities produce different antiquities. And that one could, in that sense, substitute something like classical for antiquity. Different societies classify different periods, and that leads to creations of different kinds of post-classical societies, intermediate, medieval, ones in the middle, and one could see how this, very helpful to see how this is done in the Chinese case as well as in the West European. But these seem to be quite different, and one technique would be to keep them different. So they're two different subjects. One's cultural history, one's economic, whatever. The risk of this comes, I suppose, if we take the line that etic is just our image, and that our own particular common understanding of modernity has created that unproblematic notion of antiquity that we're then studying in the first sense. And so, and I was partly thinking about this because a long time ago Mike wrote a paper called Modernist Fantasies in Prehistory, which talks a little bit about how difficult it is to conceptualise and understand and explain social processes, economic processes in prehistory, without taking a lot of our modern baggage in there. And so I suppose, I'm not sure if it is a question, but there seems to be something different between that sort of approach to antiquity and, if you like, Eleanor's sort of model of the seabed as a sort of map of different levels of antiquity, different depths and so on. And how far is the antiquity that's being studied something that we can actually be confident in a realistic, objective way is out there? And how far are what you're setting out to explain and to conceptualise simply a product of our temporary and contemporary notion of modernity?
Well, as I say, Greg always asks really difficult questions. And earlier on today, Greg and I were chatting about a time many years ago when Christian Christiansen, the archaeologist, invited us both to Gothenburg together to get this series of lectures. He neglected to tell us before we got there how many lectures it was going to be. And we were astonished when we got there to discover we were expecting like 4 times as many lectures as we'd been thinking we were going to do. But after one of the talks I gave there, Greg asked a question which shortly thereafter led me to abandon the book project I was writing on. So I'm kind of hoping that we're not back there again, because I've taken the advance now. This could get quite awkward. But yeah, I guess, as has happened in the past, you've asked a question that's making me think, I haven't thought enough about these sorts of issues. And I guess in one way I would say I haven't thought enough about these kinds of issues, but I'm not really going to bother thinking very much more, to be honest. Because it seems to me one way... maybe this, again, is a cop-out to avoid facing the sort of problems you're talking about, is to say, well, really, do we need to get our knickers in a big twist over this? Historians live in a particular time and place and write histories trying to solve questions that seem important and interesting to them in that time and place. Should I really worry whether somebody who lived 300 years ago would find my book interesting, or somebody in the future will find my book interesting? What's wrong with just saying... E.H. Carr in his book, What is History, has this wonderful image. He's talking about how historians love to talk about the sort of the grand procession of history, and they see it all as this procession marching forward. But he says the problem historians often have is they imagine themselves as standing up in this bandstand up at the prime ministers and generals, viewing the procession of history before them, and they fail to realise you're in the procession yourself. And where you are, where the procession happened, where you are in the procession and how its winding path is going, that determines what you can see and understand of the past and what you're going to find interesting and important. And in a way, I think he was absolutely right about this, and that there's nothing wrong with saying, well, in a world of rapidly rising population, resource depletion, all these kinds of challenges, is it really so terrible if we let that say to us, let that start us thinking, these are the things I find interesting and important. So this is the kind of way I'm going to look at the past. And if people in 50 years' time don't want to look at it that way, well, fine, then they'll have more to do if I don't write about it that way.
I completely take that. We're all write within our own time, how could we not? And of course we have to write to the interest of ourselves and our potential readers, but it's more that sense of modernist fantasies that worries me a little bit. That there's this, I took it that I might maybe want to recant or say a misremembered, which is very likely. But my impression was the idea was that it is easy to produce a modern view that's unreflective, which carries some fantasies with us. And so it's that sense of sort of interrogation about the extent to which we can shed some baggage. I mean, of course, we can never stand outside time. If we could, we'd never publish books that people read in time.
Yes.
A good way to avoid the problem about the advance receding into the deep past. But so it's that sense of sort of levels of confidence we can have about creating an object to study called antiquity.
Yeah, I guess the way I tend to feel about it is, we have questions, and of course, there's lots of different we's out there, but different communities of scholars have questions about the past which might not have made any sense at all to people in the past. And that, I don't see that as being a problem. I mean, some people would say, well, when we're talking about issues that people in the past themselves didn't have a word for or a concept of, that means we've gone seriously wrong here. We're dealing with something that made no sense emically, and we probably shouldn't be doing that. I mean, I tend to feel that's not the case, and there's nothing wrong with saying, well, let's talk about, say, something like Moses Finley would say, it's no point talking about GDP per capita in the ancient Greek and Roman world. This is a concept, economic growth is a concept that's simply not relevant. And I mean, I feel very strongly he was just completely wrong about that. I feel there's no problem with putting very modernist questions on the table and asking them. Where it becomes a problem, I think, is when you let your modernist concerns give you the answers as well, where you can't ever be wrong because you know what you're going to find before you start looking. You've already decided. Again, I think we all have a tendency to be able to talk ourselves into believing that what we think is a really good question will then turn out to be one. You spent a lot of time working on this book. You convinced yourself this was a good idea. I think then I would say that's where the community of scholars comes in. Because I write this book saying it's global antiquity, it works this way, it works that way. And then the rest of you say, no, it doesn't. And you laugh at me, and nobody ever reads the book again. And I'm a great believer in the sort of the power of the community of scholars to work these things out. And if I write something that is a modernist fantasy, then I feel confident after the reception I've got here over the last day or two that people will point this out to me.
I have a question which I hope you won't take the wrong way.
Oh, no. If you have to ask that, then I know that I will.
But it is very much, it's not without context, I hope, because it is about this idea of a community of scholars. And it goes back, I keep going back in my mind to Eleanor Robson's description of her Iraqi colleague who risked his life to make a point about an ancient site. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that within our community of scholars, we're all engaged with rather different levels of risk when we undertake to write these very broad kind of history books. So I suppose my question is, if you had to risk something more than your advance, would you write this book, and if so, why?
That's an interesting question. I guess I've spent a little bit of time in university administration at Stanford, and one of the conclusions I came to while I was doing that was that part of the genius of the modern research university is it's an institution designed to lower the risk level for academics by having we have an apprenticeship. I guess you've done away with this in Britain now, in theory at least, but we have this apprenticeship process, the tenure track, and then you get tenure, and no matter what you do, at least intellectually, we can't fire you. And so you are free to take absolutely any risk you want, which always makes me despair when I see colleagues who've basically been rewriting the same book for 30 years. Here you're given this astonishing opportunity. You can do whatever you want. And what you want to do is keep writing the same book over and over again. That is just really sad. And so, I mean, I feel I'm lucky enough to be in a time and a place where people have created institutions where by sort of abandoning my career as an Iron Age Greek archaeologist and deciding I'm going to go off and learn Chinese history next week. The worst thing that could potentially happen to me was that I would get some bad reviews. And I think that's fantastic. I love this, and I think the people who created modern universities are greatly to be praised for giving us these opportunities. Whether I would do something like this if I lived in a place like the Soviet Union, that's a totally different question altogether, because there are plenty of parts of the world where governments strive to do the exact opposite of a modern liberal research university and raise the risks to academics for saying the wrong kinds of things. And yeah, I mean, luckily for me, I've not had to worry about this. And I mean, I was thinking discussions about risk and risk aversion. I just always think you never know what you would do until you have to. And I mean, a lot of people find when it comes to it, they're much braver than they think they're going to be. And a lot of people find they're not as brave as they're going to be. And fortunately, I've been in a position where nobody's ever asked me to risk my life for my ideas. I've had my life threatened, actually, quite a number of times, but not by people who I thought were seriously going to act on it. I wrote a book last year on the history of war, which produced a level of outrage I didn't know I was capable of generating. I don't think anybody felt that strongly about anything I said. But the good thing with that was the people who were really most upset with me were pretty much all pacifists. And if you're a pacifist, there's a limit to how aggressive you can be before you defeat your own argument. So none of the pacifists actually threatened to kill me. They wished some very, very unpleasant things on me, but nobody said, I'm coming to your house, I know where you live, I'm going to kill you. That hasn't happened for several years now.
Maria.
I suppose following on in terms of why write in this sort of way, I wonder to what extent do you feel predictiveness is an important feature of this kind of work, because clearly there have been moments in some of the books you've written where part of what you say is that there are implications to these patterns that we see for the future. And I wondered to what extent do you feel that is an integral driver or just a sort of tailpiece to this sort of work. But there is very much a sense of a movement forward and a development and perhaps a progress, but a progress that therefore you suggest we can see what's coming. And I wonder to what extent that is important to you in writing in this sort of way.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and this time it's a question I have actually thought about a little bit for once. And I mean, I would sort of take the sense of why write this sort of book, to take that question in two different ways. I mean, one is having decided, hey, I really want to go write a book about the history of the world or whatever. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, and one way, nearly all my books up till 10 years ago have been published with the university presses, and one way to write a book would be to do another one with the university press, and lots and lots and lots of footnotes and all that kind of stuff. And I chose not to do that and to start publishing with trade presses instead. Even though it's if you've only written for academic presses, it's a bit of a jolt to start writing for a trade press, because you need to write in a very, very different way. But I felt that this came down to a much bigger question about what I'm employed as historian, archaeologist, whatever. What do I think history and archaeology are actually for? I mean, is the point of the exercise to do something that, say, persuades a group of people like are in this room, a group of professional experts on history and archaeology? And I think, clearly the answer has to be yes to that. If you can't persuade, I mean, maybe not going to persuade everybody in this room, but people of this kind, if you can't persuade at least a good sized minority of the professional experts, of the sort of sensibleness of what you're saying, then there's something wrong with it. So that you have to be answering yes to that question. But I just feel that that's not the whole point of the exercise. I mean, history is something people do. People want to understand the world, and many people think that the past is a powerful tool for understanding the present. And I think that's absolutely right. I think you can't understand the world without understanding history. Many professional historians, I mean, I find professional historians really a deeply peculiar breed of people. Like almost every academic discipline you encounter, like economists, I mean, you guys are among the worst with this. You say to an economist, what is your subject good for? And they say it's good for everything. You study my subject, you will answer all problems. You don't study my subject, you will understand nothing. Economics is everything. And you ask a historian, what is history good for? And they say, well, the one thing history teaches you is that history teaches you nothing. And then we profess to be surprised when we can't have funding for more graduate students with that sort of view on the world. I don't think this is how most people think about history. I think most people think history, the past, provides patterns which help you understand the present and, in a limited degree at least, help you understand the future. And I think that's right. I think that it's difficult, though, to draw the right lessons from the history. And, I mean, like, say, like in the US in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, I mean, the same colleagues in the history department who were saying history teaches you nothing about the future, they tended to be the people who are saying most strongly, if only the President of the United States had known just a little bit about Middle Eastern history, he would have predicted the future a little bit differently. And my feeling is that when we actually come down to it, even the professional historians believe that the past is a good guide to predicting the future. And there's just no way to get around that. But the question then is, how well can you do it? And I guess, I mean, I tend to get rather cold feet about claiming that I do know what's going to happen next. But I do think that the patterns, the big patterns we've seen in the past, allow you to start sketching out some sort of parameters of where things are likely to go next. At least rule out some possibilities, or say some things are less likely than others. And it seems to me that's a really powerful use of the past. And if more people believe this, then historians would be happier people, I think.
This sounds to me as if we couldn't end on a more positive note, although I'm sure there are many more questions. This might be a good time to call this part of the proceedings to a halt, not least because we need to get to cross the whole of the college to get to where the reception is, and we need to get there before security shuts it all down. So I vote we make a move, but not before thanking Ian especially, of course, but all our speakers, and indeed all of you who are here, very much indeed for what I felt was a very successful event.